A seam is the basic structural element of any piece of clothing and should be formed with care. The seam that I will be demonstrating today is a closed plain seam, which is the basis for just about all other seams. The seam consists of a well-made straight seam, where the stitching is exactly the same distance from the seam edge for the entire length of the seam. The seam is then finished off by neatly overlocking the two fabric edges together. Start by placing the right sides or right face of the fabric together. Make sure to match up any notches. Pin the fabric together at regular intervals. Place pins perpendicular to the seam line towards the seam edge. Make sure to pin the seam with your seam edge to the right, as this is how you will sew your seam on your machine. Adjust your machine to the correct stitch pattern. For this seam, a plain straight stitch is used. Also adjust your stitch length, needle position and tension. Position the needle on your seam line according to the seam allowance. Use the seam allowance guides on your machine plate to align. Lower the presser foot and start by stitching a few stitches. Backstitch to the end and then continue to forward stitch on the seam line. Remove any pins as you go along to avoid stitching over them. At the end of your seam, do another backstitch to secure the seam. Clip the loose threads close to the stitching. Make sure to set your iron on a setting that is appropriate to your fabric. Now for the most important part of the process. Do not skip this step. Press the seam flat in the same direction to set the stitches into the fabric. For a really crisp and professional looking seam, also flat press the seam to the opposite side. Before pressing open, and then flat again. Flat press the seam to either center front or center back. Choose the manner that will reduce the most bulk. The next step will be to add a seam finish, and will prevent the fabric from raveling while also contributing to the overall neatness of the seam. And just because we're extra, give the seam a quick final flat press. Last but not least, admire your work.